Claim number 2. The police are targeting, shooting, and killing blacks disproportionately. One of the most pernicious and deliberately misleading lies, which would have been so easily avoided had people not reflexively reacted against each killing, whether it was George Floyd or Breonna Taylor, and not automatically assumed that it was race-based. Unfortunately, emotional reaction is so much easier and more rewarding than honest, fact-based conversation. The most comprehensive study ever done on this topic was by Roland Fryer, himself a black academic, in his 2016 paper, An Empirical Analysis of Racial Differences in Police Use of Force. Fryer concluded that the facts do not support the Black Lives Matter narrative. Police is actually slightly more likely to use lethal force when the suspect is white. More surprising, however, is that the likelihood of force, including lethal force, increases for black suspects if the officer is black or Hispanic. In 2018, a separate paper titled "Is There Evidence of Racial Disparity in Police Use of Deadly Force" by Dr. Joseph Cesario and colleagues looked at police shootings over a 2-year period between 2015 to 2016 and made 3 definite conclusions. 1. There is no evidence of systematic anti-black disparities in overall fatal shootings. 2. There is no evidence of systematic anti-black disparities in fatal shootings of unarmed citizens. 3. There is no evidence of systematic anti-black disparities in fatal shootings involving misidentification of objects as weapons. Great news, surely? Not so. These facts threaten the existence of the institutions and people who have made their entire careers based on the false notion of black victimhood by the hands of police, as well as a dishonest media whose viewership or readership and clicks is contingent on not reporting the truth but to cause sensational uproars. In 2019, there were 55 unarmed people shot by the police. 14 were black, 25 were white. The likelihood of being shot by police when unarmed is as high as being struck by lightning. It is also important to note that being unarmed does not equate to being harmless. The vast majority of shootings occur when the victim charges at an officer, who may lose his gun in a struggle and make the suspect more dangerous to the officer himself as well as his or her surroundings. The best example of this is the shooting of Michael Brown in Ferguson, Missouri, which spawned the Black Lives Matter movement and the narrative of hands up, don't shoot. The claim has been that Officer Darren Wilson shot Michael Brown as the young black man had his hands up in the air, pleading with his eventual executioner not to shoot. In reality, nothing of the sort happened. Witnesses, white and black, as well as the Brown family's own coroner, conducting independent autopsies, all concurred that Brown charged after Officer Wilson's weapon. This has been verified and corroborated by multiple sources, independent experts, and forensic examinations, which is why the grand jury, 3 of whom were black, exonerated Officer Wilson. In other words, the entire Black Lives Matter movement is founded on a lie. At no point did Michael Brown raise his hands or say the now famous slogan, "Hands up, don't shoot." The rioting and lootings in Ferguson, as well as across America, almost exclusively in black neighborhoods, could have been avoided, and the livelihoods of thousands of black-owned businesses could have been spared had honesty, instead of false propaganda, won the day. Instead, these communities are still, 6 years after the fact, suffering, and many businesses are nowhere near a recovery. Similar arguments can be made for all the famous cases on which these movements, as well as charlatans like Al Sharpton and Ta-Nehisi Coates, are profiteering on. The killing of George Floyd by Officer Derek Chauvin was a reprehensible and evil act which has been condemned by the entire world. Floyd has become the latest symbol of black oppression by American law enforcement. The truth, however inconvenient, is that there has been zero arguments laid forward to back the accusation of this having been a racial crime. In fact, 4 years earlier, police in Dallas killed a 36-year-old mentally ill white man called Tony Timpa in the exact same way. What's perhaps even more disturbing about the Timpa case is that it was he himself who called the police to come and get him. Floyd became international news. Timpa is practically unknown. The case of Breonna Taylor is incredibly disturbing. While sleeping in her bed next to her boyfriend, the police conducted a no-knock search into her apartment, believing it belonged to someone else. Taylor's boyfriend, fearing it may be intruders, fired shots at the officers, who shot back, and during the exchange, one officer was wounded and Taylor was tragically killed. This happened on the 13th of March 2020. On the 12th of March 2020, a young man named Duncan Lemp was killed by Montgomery County Police Department SWAT team during a no-knock raid. Lemp, who was seemingly a member of the far-right group 3 centimeters, did not shoot at the police and had no weapon on him when he shot. Breonna Taylor's case has become international news. Lemp is practically unknown. The case of Tamir Rice, a 13-year-old black boy killed by police when playing with a toy gun, is indescribably tragic. The same thing happened to Antonio Arce, a 14-year-old white boy. Tamir Rice became international news. Very few people even know of Arce. The same can be said of Daniel Shaver, Andrew Thomas, Dylan Noble, James Boyd, Brandon Stanley, and Mary Hawkes, all killed in eerily similar ways to the likes of Alton Sterling, Trayvon Martin, and Sam DuBose. You've heard of the latter, not of the former. This is what Coleman Hughes calls coverage bias. The news media and race vultures profiteer on fabrication and maximizing divisions. The sole reason for the existence of NAACP is to focus on black victimhood. If it doesn't exist, they will manufacture it. Policing in America. The reality of policing in America is more oblique than the narrative claims. Law enforcement operate in a country of 330 million inhabitants and 270 million guns. This is the only country on earth of which this can be said. Every single encounter, whether it's a seemingly innocuous traffic stop, shoplifting, even littering, comes with the potential of ending in armed conflict. Add to that the fact that a police officer is shot every single day in America, a third of whom fatally, and the reality of policing in the world's third most populous country becomes clearer and more desolate. This is not to say that there are no rotten eggs. or even that the system does not need reviewing and changing. Practices such as qualified immunity and no-knock searches, and institutions such as the police unions should be questioned. But what is clear is that the American law enforcement is not systematically racist. 20% of American law enforcement is constituted by blacks, Hispanics, and other minorities, many of whom are chiefs of police. This is just not reconcilable with the notion of a racist institution. Claim 3. Disparities in prison population proves racism. This is an argument best exemplified in Michelle Alexander's book, The New Jim Crow, which has achieved an almost biblical reverence within the anti-racist movement of 21st century. Unfortunately for Alexander and her proponents, debunking her claim takes only a few seconds. In her book, Alexander has included a deluge of statistics and sources showing how blacks in the American prison population are overrepresented by looking at the demographics of the country. However, there's not a single study, not one, that shows crime rates by population. This is an astonishing omission, undoubtedly intentional, as it will immediately deflate her entire thesis. The claim itself is a logical fallacy. Claiming disparity by looking at population demographics instead of crime statistics assumes that all ethnic groups commit crime at the exact same rates. In reality, however, different demographics break the law at vastly different levels. To demonstrate the flaw in this methodology, imagine demographic X constituting 10% of a country's population, but committing 0% of crimes within that country. According to Alexander's logic, we should still expect demographic X to make up 10% of the prison population. This is illogical at best, but dishonest at worst. When looking at prison population compared to crime statistics, the data is disheartening. Black people are approximately 14% of the population in America, yet commit around 50% of all homicides. This can be broken down further to paint an even more disheartening picture. It's not the women or the children or the elderly committing the murders. It's overwhelmingly done by young black males aged 15 to 35. In other words, about 4% of the American population commit 50% of all murders. Let me repeat that. 4% of the population commit 50% of all the murders. The main cause of death for black men aged 1 to 14, 15 to 24, 25 to 34, and 35 to 44 is other black men. This cannot be said about any other demographic in America. You will find similar or even more demoralizing figures when looking at violent crime, armed robbery, auto thefts, and even classically white-collar crimes such as counterfeiting, fraud, and embezzlement. In her book, Alexander makes the claim that Ronald Reagan's war on drugs was designed to bring back Jim Crow laws through the back door. This is similar to the theory put forward by Ava DuVernay in her Oscar-nominated film The 13th. However, as Heather MacDonald has noted, in 2006, blacks were 37.5% of 1,274,600 prison inmates in state prisons, which house 88% of the country's inmates. If you were to remove drug prisoners from this population, the percentage of black prisoners would drop to 37%, half a percentage point. The prison population demographic is not disproportionately black. The demographics are in proportion to the rates of crime committed by different groups. Asian Americans are 5.9% of the American population, but make up only 1.5% of the prison population. Did Reagan and company have a pro-Asian agenda that would particularly benefit people from communist China? Another argument often put forward is that of America being an prison industrial complex. Proponents point to private prisons run for profit as a clear indication of how America is capitalizing on mass incarceration, majority of whom are black. What they leave out is that private prisons make up less than 9% of all prisons in America. How about state-run prisons, which constitute 80% of all prisons in America? As Coleman Hughes has pointed out, each state has their own laws and different way of running things. Add to that the fact that many of these states are run by black elected officials, and the claim that this is a racist system starts falling apart. In reality, there is no such thing as the prison system. There are more than 50 different systems, each with their own idiosyncrasies, practices, and laws. Therefore, just looking at the prison population as a single totality and drawing any conclusions is deeply flawed. One of the worst yet most common defenses may sound like this. Yes, maybe black Americans do commit a higher rate of crimes, but that's because 400 years of oppression and racism, as well as poverty caused by such practices. This argument is not just inaccurate, it borders on racism. First, let's look at why it doesn't hold up to scrutiny. During the height of racism and discrimination, when Jim Crow laws, redlining, and state-sponsored racism were practiced, black American crime rates were nowhere near the numbers we see today. That alone debunks the claim that it is racism or slavery that caused such behaviors, unless someone wishes to claim that America is more racist today than before the civil rights movement made such enormous strides, but then they have an insurmountable burden of proof. How about other groups who were subjected to racism and suffered from poverty? From Coleman Hughes' article, Black American Culture and the Racial Wealth Gap. Starting with the California Alien Land Law of 1913, 14 states passed laws preventing Japanese American peasant farmers from owning land and property. These laws existed until 1952, when the Supreme Court ruled them unconstitutional. Add to this the internment of 120,000 Japanese Americans during World War II, and it's fair to say that the Japanese were given no bootstraps in America. Nevertheless, by 1970, census data showed Japanese Americans out-earning Anglo-Americans, Irish Americans, German Americans, Italian Americans, and Polish Americans. For Asian Americans on the whole, an analysis of wealth data from 1989 to 2013 predicted that their median wealth soon will surpass the white median level. If wealth differences were largely explained by America's history of favoring certain groups over others, then it would be hard to explain why Asian Americans, who were never favored, are on the track to become wealthier than whites. In the same article, Hughes also takes on the assertion that slavery is a cause for black poverty as well as white wealth, by pointing out that the southern states that practiced slavery are today markedly poorer than their northern counterparts who didn't indulge in such actions. The exact same trends can be observed in Brazil, where formerly abolitionist southern region has been and continues to be wealthier than the formerly slave-owning northern regions? Or how about the nation-state of Singapore, which was raided by Portuguese colonizers and later by British settlers, yet today is wealthier than both European countries? Or how about Jewish Americans? The most persecuted people in history were not spared anti-Semitism in America, targeted by the same KKK as blacks, subjected to restrictive real estate covenants preventing Hebrews from living in particular neighborhoods, not to mention the influences of Henry Ford, Walt Disney and Charles Lindbergh on the culture, which cannot be trivialized. Add to this the pogroms and of course the Holocaust, and one cannot reasonably make claims that the Jewish people had any privileges afforded them. Yet Jewish Americans are today one of the most successful ethnic groups in America. And finally, if it is in fact racism that is preventing blacks from succeeding in America, then what would explain the enormous success of black immigrants? Already in the 1970s, when racism was far more prevalent than today, black Americans from the West Indies were out-earning African Americans by 58%. These people had the same history of slavery as the African Americans. They often came to America with nothing but the clothes on their back, yet within one generation, they were out-earning even some white groups. Today, according to Nielsen's report, increasingly affluent, educated and diverse, African American consumers, the untold story. Caribbean immigrants earn on average 30% more than black Americans. Racism and slavery are no reasonable explanation. But as mentioned, the argument is also racist. It says that black people can't help but be criminals because of their history of oppression. Insinuated within the argument is the idea that blacks have been deterministically programmed to be criminals by white oppression and have no personal agency to help themselves. If you blame black crime on determinism programmed into them by white people, then you have to explain why the majority of black people don't commit crime. And you must explain why the overwhelming majority of those who do are young men who did not experience slavery, Jim Crow or redlining. And why do black women not commit crime anywhere near as much? And you have to explain how slavery, which was abolished in 1865, and Jim Crow, which ended with the Brown versus Board of Education ruling in 1954, or discrimination based on race, which was made illegal with the ratification of the Civil Rights Act in 1964, is causing children to kill their contemporaries over sneakers. Conclusion. If you agree that black people are as capable, as intelligent and worthy as whites, you must apply the same standards of expectations and levels of responsibilities on them. The paternalism and reducing black people to the lowest common denominator, the only ethnic group with whom the left do this, must stop. As long as progressives keep making excuses for the worst behaviors of blacks and claiming it is white people's faults that blacks commit violent crime at a disproportionate rate, and reducing black people to the worst qualities, more black people will suffer the consequences. It is estimated that 93% of all black murders are committed against black victims. Similar figures can be shown for most crimes. Perpetrator and victim are overwhelmingly same race. And the more the left make excuses for this pathology instead of focusing on the victims, the less likelihood there is for any advancement.